Representative Jared Huffman, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Steve. Good to be with you.
Now, I was just looking at your Twitter feed and was a little concerned. You had tweeted a picture of yourself on the red eye coming back from Washington this weekend. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, that photo was the red eye going to Washington for the vote. And the reason I wanted to tweet it is I want people to see what it's like to fly right now. If you don't need to fly, you really shouldn't. The airlines have cut back dramatically on the number of flights. And even though they had promised to use distancing strategies and leave middle seats vacant, they're not doing that. They're packing these planes. And I feel like I did what I could to protect myself. I wore an N95 mask the whole time. I was wiping down, everything I came in contact with. But, I worry about a lot of the general public, if they have to fly, that the airlines are putting them at risk. And I just wanted people to get a look at that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing that. We really appreciate your putting this into the agenda, and it's very, very important. Now, you were very busy in Washington on Friday, and I did want you to give us a sense of the drama of that day as the House of Representatives passes a $3 trillion legislative package. Can you
Yeah.
tell me what you feel are the highlights of that bill?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to the highlights of the bill, but to your point about the drama of the moment, I mean, you would expect a lot of drama associated with a $3 trillion piece of legislation in a critical moment for our country like this. But like everything else during this pandemic, it was a little surreal. Members are not even wanting to go anywhere near each other for obvious reasons. Everybody's wearing masks for the most part, although we have a significant number of Republican colleagues who have decided to ignore public health guidance. They don't wear masks. They were kind of mugging it up and walking around without distancing. So that stood out as well. And then members were brought down to the floor in groups where we were just not around each other in the normal way. And we had to maintain distancing. You literally have to walk in a certain pattern in and out of the floor to cast your vote and then to get out of there. So it's unlike any other moment in our country's history, the operations of the House of Representatives right now. But I think the impact of what we did is significant. We put forward a bill that reflects the actual scale of what we believe this crisis to be. And we think that that includes more than just kind of a one-time shot to a little bit of direct assistance and a little more unemployment for, a few weeks, and this paycheck protection loan thing for 10 weeks for some companies where it works. We think this is a much longer lasting and deeper crisis than what any of that has reflected. And I'm pleased that we actually put forward at least, an opening bid from one house of Congress that matches the scale of the crisis, that does far more than any of those things, that actually pushes hundreds of billions of dollars down to state and local governments. That's the next point of this crisis that has to be addressed, because when you think about the essential services that all of our local governments support, not just maintaining our roads and things like that, but public safety, sanitation, public health, their revenue streams have collapsed and they are struggling to keep the lights on all over this country. And if Congress doesn't step in and help them right now, we are going to make this crisis much, much worse.
Now, you mentioned that this was sort of an opening bid and that your Republican colleagues aren't necessarily on board with the scope of your $3 trillion package. Where do you find are going to be the points where you can come together and really get something done for the American people over these next couple of weeks?
I think that's going to depend on their willingness to open their eyes and see the crisis in its full extent. When you have Mitch McConnell saying, let's just take a pause and wait for a while, when you have the Trump administration engaging in this happy talk about a V-shaped recovery and giving all these mixed messages, on the one hand, acknowledging some of the public health concerns, on the other hand, applauding as states recklessly move forward with relaxing and reopening without following the rules. Um, we're just going to have to force them into a better conversation about how to address this crisis, which starts with acknowledging what's actually happening out there. The other part of our bill that I'm pleased to see that we're going to need to keep pushing on is that we looked ahead to November. We recognize that we've got a national election that's critically important, that is going to be hard to conduct if there's a major outbreak and if we're not prepared to give voters tools like a mail-in ballot all over this country so that we can safely proceed. We don't want a repeat of what happened in Wisconsin a few weeks ago, where they weren't prepared and they had this chaos with the governor saying don't have the election, the Supreme Court saying have the election even though it's not safe, and then voters are presented with this terrible choice of making themselves ill or not voting. So we include that in the bill that we passed out a few days ago, and we also include something that is essential for that and other aspects of our economy to keep working, which is support for the U.S. Postal Service. They're in real trouble, and our president has deeply politicized the financial situation at the Postal Service and kind of carried into that issue some of his own personal vendettas against Jeff Bezos and Amazon in the most childish and political way imaginable. So we put a good postal funding provision into that bill, and that's something that we're going to continue to fight for.
All right. I also noticed that there's talk in your bill of heroes, and that very specifically you feel that there are some members of our communities who are not really being recognized for the hard work that they're doing, for the important work that they're doing as essential workers. Tell me who you feel are the heroes in this crisis and what your bill does for them.
Well, a lot of these heroes are the frontline health workers that you mentioned, but many of them do work for state and local governments. And that's why that state and local government fund piece of the HEROES Act was really important to provide the support we need for the people that are putting themselves at risk and keeping all of us safe. But more than that, we also included hazard pay for all of the essential workers, not just healthcare, but folks working in our grocery stores and other essential jobs where we know that they're taking a risk, where we desperately need them to do these things, but we're not giving them either the protective equipment or the extra financial support needed. And a lot of these folks are getting sick. The more we begin to get back the data, we're seeing that, yeah, that risk is very real. And so it's totally appropriate that we would provide some hazard pay for all essential workers as we work on those other components of the challenge going forward.
All right. Now that brings up another question that I think I'd like you to weigh in on, if you could. There seemed to be a fight brewing here in Sonoma County, as elsewhere in the country, about opening. And some in our Latinx community say that reopening our economy will be on their backs. From farm workers to domestic workers to fast food workers to healthcare workers who are mostly Latinx and often female and who can't work from home. So I'd like to really get your point of view about what we need to be thinking about now that we have some of the demographic data to suggest that our Latinx community in Sonoma County is being disproportionately affected.
Well, they're right. Let me just associate myself with those concerns. And we are finally beginning to get some resolution on the data that shows just how disproportionately they have been hurt. Now, part of that is because of socioeconomic factors, the fact that we have greater density in a lot of the living arrangements. We have larger family units in many cases. We have some pre-existing health conditions and comorbidities, as they say, which may not address the vulnerability to exposure, but certainly addresses the severity of the impacts once someone is exposed. And so we've seen both more exposures and more healthcare complications within these minority communities than in other more affluent communities. And it's something we have to tackle. I'm pleased to see that we did that in the HEROES Act that we passed. We included resources so that we can surge testing and tracking and tracing into these communities. And by the way, everybody agrees that there's three legs to the stool for tackling this pandemic. You got to do testing, you got to do tracking and tracing, and you've got to do meaningful isolation when you identify people with the virus. But that means we got to hire hundreds of thousands of people around this country to do that tracking and tracing. And we've got to make sure that they are culturally proficient and sensitive to go into these communities and to actually do an adequate job to establish the trust that they're going to need for cooperation in these communities. And then you can't just assume that it's possible for someone who's working 3 jobs and crammed into an apartment with either a large family unit or with other roommates to isolate. They've got nowhere to go. So we're going to have to figure out a way to finance that and to either pay them or to enter into relationships with hotels or other places to have serious, meaningful isolation, or else the spread will continue. So lots of reasons why we've got to put more of a focus into these communities.
All right, that really sounds like a very important thing. Tell me, looking forward, these next 3 months, say, or more, how do you see the work of the House of Representatives continuing? I know you don't want to get on too many more of those potentially dangerous flights back and forth across the country. So how do you think the House is going to be adapting to the new reality?
For the first time in the history of this country, we've changed the rules of the House. So we did this on Friday to allow for remote proceedings and proxy voting. Those are the 2 tools that I think will get us through this pandemic. Proxy voting means that while some members may be there in person in the Capitol, other members will provide written instruction to one of their colleagues on how to cast that vote for them. We'll need to carefully document that, but that's how that will work. And then to make sure that our committees begin to function again, and we've been off the field for 2 months. This is we've really missed something by not having an entire branch of government doing its job for 2 months. We are enabling remote participation in hearings. And that, I think, is the most critical of all, because we've got to get back into providing oversight, into moving legislation and having markups and tackling the work of the country, which hasn't stopped just because of this pandemic. I mean, you've still got all kinds of must-pass legislation that have to go through the committee process. So this new change of the rules is going to really dramatically help. And in fact, just before I joined you on this Zoom call, Steve, I held a virtual hearing at my subcommittee on water, oceans, and wildlife. We wanted to do a deep dive on what's going on in fishing communities around this country that are facing really unique impacts, because a lot of a huge amount of their commerce goes through restaurants, and their entire supply chain is designed to move seafood out through restaurants. And that has just gone completely dark. Add to that the fact that all of their export business has shut down because of the pandemic. And we've got a lot of pain being felt in fishing communities around the country. So we had a great hearing to talk about that. Our Republican colleagues refused to join us, unfortunately. But they're going to have to join us going forward. We got to get back to work.
All right. And as you get back to work, in the last minute or so that we have, give me a sense of your priorities right now. What do you feel, is your job number one? You're back home, you're in Sonoma County, you're getting ready to do this work. You just had a hearing virtually in Washington, D.C., but I know your heart is here in Sonoma County. So, tell me about your priorities right now.
Well, thanks for that question. So I want to get back to as much of the normal business of Congress as we can, because it's really important, and it can't just indefinitely be suspended. At the same time, I've got to be very mindful of this moment that we're in and trying to get my head around the best possible information and science, thinking through the policy implications. If we truly are headed into something like the Great Depression, and I fear that, I don't want to cause alarmism, but this is going to be a long crisis. And I think we need to have a very clear-eyed understanding of that. I want to make sure that I'm not bringing half measures to something that demands really big, outside the box transformational thinking. And so I'm trying to reimagine some of how we help people in the context of this crisis. And it's something I spend a lot of time on. So for example, the unemployment system, that's a huge part of our safety net in this country when people are thrown out of work. but we have 50 different states with 50 different programs, some of which work well, some of which are terrible and dysfunctional, and people can't even get in the queue to get the relief they need. And there's other aspects of this that I'm really trying to get my head around so that I can be part of an appropriate federal response to this really big moment that we're all in.
All right, Jared Huffman, thank you really so much for taking the time to join us. And as we move forward through this together, I hope you'll be a regular visitor so that we can really find out your thinking and find out how we're moving the country forward together. So thanks so much.
I look forward to that, Steve. Thanks for your flexibility in joining me today. I know we were really struggling to make the schedule work, but I'll look forward to visiting with you anytime.
Thanks so much.